It's my great pleasure today to introduce two close friends. I keep wondering which one's the apple, which one's the orange. The last 20 minutes I've been wondering that. I guess you're the apple.
I live in New York.
Yeah. Hey, I guessed right. So yeah, we have Steve Flusberg today, and we have Paul Thibodeau, and I often think of them, and so do many others, as the dynamic duo of modern day metaphor research. They're transforming how we do metaphor research and making it much more of a visible, important thing in and around the cognitive sciences. So any of the latest research you see out there that's cited on metaphor, it'll often say Flusberg, Thibodeau, and sometimes the two of them together. Lots of visionary research, not just showing that language influences thought, but going into how language influences thought, which is the bigger, harder question, which some of us will be studying and following their role and stuff in the coming years. So it's a pleasure to have them there. Just a couple of words about each of them. Steve Flusberg did his PhD at Stanford in psychology. A lot of his research has focused on how everyday language influences our thoughts and our actions, and some of that has social relevance. So for things like crime and so on. Paul Thibodeau also did his PhD at Stanford, and at the same time, you guys finished the same time, right? And they worked a bit with Lara Boroditsky, and they worked with others as well on metaphor and other high-level cognition and language issues. Okay, I'm going to turn the floor over to them now, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you all for coming. It's a really nice honor to be invited to Merced. This is we've had a chance to meet some of the grad students and postdocs and faculty, and we've been having a lot of fun. It's kind of awkward, I think. Maybe we're giving this talk together, and so like Paul's standing over there, and we're gonna kind of like weave in and out. So just bear with us. It was hard to choreograph. We arm wrestled for who had to go first, and as you can see, so I got to do the introduction. So the way that I think a lot of this stuff started with Paul's interest in grad school, and he kind of roped me into thinking about metaphor and reasoning in this way. But a lot of the motivation for the research we're going to talk about today comes from thinking about the actual problems that people face, which for many scientists, people in universities, in their heads down in the trenches doing the research, we sometimes forget about. But when you start to look at what the big problems that we as a society face are, you can see that they're pretty obviously difficult to solve. So for example, a lot of people these days are asking, how can we get the economy back on track? How can we fix a broken educational system? How do we fight world hunger? What can we do about the crime epidemic? And how do we win the race against climate change? And these are all large, complex issues. One thing that they have in common is that when we talk about these issues, we often rely on metaphors, comparisons to other domains. So when we talk about getting the economy back on track, we're describing the economy as some sort of train that's maybe fallen off of a track. That's not good. We need to get it back on the track so that it can keep moving forward. When we talk about fixing a broken educational system, we're framing the issue as some sort of malfunctioning machine. As we'll see today, for each of these issues, there's usually not just one metaphor for talking about them. There might be lots of different metaphors for talking about them, and one of the things we're going to ask is, does that matter? Does the metaphor that we use to just talk about one of these situations affect how people think and reason about it? You don't have to take my word and these sort of made-up examples for looking at how prevalent metaphors are in discussions of important issues or even local issues. So if you look at the newspaper, just headlines, you can look in the New York Times, and especially during this heated political season, what you see are things like debate swerves from policy to personal attacks, using that motion metaphor. At Oberlin, where Paul is an assistant professor, recently the local newspaper said that the tobacco ban on campus carries little weight, using a physical weight metaphor with smokers. At my school, SUNY Purchase, they talked about how the Purchase bookstore got a facelift. And of course, even here, maybe due to Teeny's influence, they have a little bit more of a clever use of language that the Meso Lab's rocket research takes off. That's what we call an extended metaphor, something we'll be returning to later. And so the idea that metaphors are perhaps not just a part of language, not just how we talk about something, but reflect something about the underlying cognitive processing, how we actually represent and reason about domains, is now a classic view that's commonly associated with George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, a cognitive linguist at Berkeley and a philosopher at University of Oregon. And in their 1980 book, which is a classic now, Metaphors We Live By, they say that metaphor is not just a matter of language, that is of mere words. In other words, it's not just sort of a poetic or figurative addition to literal language. On the contrary, according to Lakoff and Johnson, human thought processes are largely metaphorical, and our conceptual system is metaphorically structured and defined. So metaphors are not just part of language, they're part of how we think about things. And this view has taken off, sometimes to the point that it's hyped up. So these are just a few books that have come out in the last few years that have really hyped up the power of metaphor as if they can do anything. So according to Ann Miller, for example, metaphors are magic and they can help you sell anything you want to anyone. According to other researchers or other scholars, metaphors can be used in therapy to solve any mental health problem you might have. Maybe they're power tools for teaching, and so on. So there's a lot of hype surrounding metaphor. And some in the cognitive science community have pushed back against this hype. So notably, Steven Pinker, cognitive psychologist and linguist, though he acknowledges that language is filled with metaphors, that people use analogies and metaphors to think, he thinks that most of the metaphors we encounter, like he says here, most are not processed as metaphors at all. They may have been alive in the minds of the original coiners, but subsequent speakers, perhaps all of us in this room, just memorize idioms by rote. That we're not actually influenced by, let's say, the metaphorical source domains that we're seeing when we process language. And one piece of evidence he likes to point to is the fact that people use and understand mixed metaphors all the time with no problem. So Cher has said, "I've been up and down so many times that I feel as if I'm in a revolving door." It's kind of humorous. It's a mixing of two different maybe spatial frames of reference for thinking about life's problems, but it's not that hard to understand what she's saying. And so maybe this is evidence that we're not really thinking about these as actual, using our spatial knowledge to understand what she's saying. We've kind of memorized what metaphors mean, and they don't actually affect us in any magical way beyond that. And this is sort of the backdrop to the research we're going to talk about today. And so one approach we've tried to take is using simple experimental designs but large-scale studies for examining how metaphors might or might not influence us when we're looking at these domains of interest, big social issues like crime, law enforcement, and climate change. So the basic outline of the talk is as follows. First, we're going to look at some basic findings, framing effects, looking at whether how we talk about an issue, how an issue is framed using one metaphor or another, does that actually influence how people think? And once by the way, the answer is yes. Then, at least to some degree. Then we're going to dive deeper and try to ask a little bit more about the underlying cognitive processing. So what's happening? How do metaphors actually work? And finally, we're going to look at some boundary conditions and examine what are the moderating factors in these metaphorical framing effects. So who do metaphors persuade and who don't they persuade? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul.
Thank you, Steve. So there are some implications of this work, both practical and theoretical, that we like to touch on before we get into the details. So there are some obvious practical implications. So if the way that we talk about important social and political issues affects the way that we think about them, then we might be designing policies in a particular way that's influenced by the metaphors that we're using. And we might be able to use metaphors as persuasive explanatory tools to convey interventions or policies that we think might be more effective. And then the theoretical implications are, as Steve mentioned earlier, they have to do with thinking about how we think. So do we think in metaphors, or do we just communicate using metaphors? And are metaphors a mechanism for thinking about abstract and complex ideas. So, do metaphors influence thought? So we're going to start with the domain of crime. And just as an aside, we were talking to a few grad students today who are in their first year and just designing their first year projects. And this was actually my first year project. So I'm still talking about it 10 years later. So, so why are we going to talk about crime? Why did I pick crime to study in my first year project? Crime's an important social issue. It levies a tremendous cost on society in terms of lives and money. So violent crime is on the rise after hitting 40-year lows. The frequency of people shot and killed by active shooters is increasing. The United States puts a tremendous number of people in jail. So about 1% of the US population is in jail, even though we only have about 5% of the world's population. We have about 25% of the world's imprisoned population. And one of the big issues that's in the news right now is the number of police shootings that we are seeing in the country. And so crime's a big important issue. And we often see people using metaphors to talk about crime. So here's one book called Predator Nation. And it talks about how individuals are at the heart of the crime problem. We need to lock them up and put them in jail for longer. Here's the cover of a New York Times Magazine article from 2007 asking, is urban violence a virus? And the metaphors that we use for crime, like the metaphors we use for a lot of social and political issues, are pervasive and they're systematic. And by systematic, I mean that we use them in an extended way. We don't just say there's a crime epidemic or there's a crime beast. We use these metaphors to talk about various aspects of crime. So we can talk about how crime attacks and preys on cities, and how detectives can catch and trap criminals, and how the prevalence of crime means that predators are looking for prey. And all of those statements appeal to this crime as a beast conceptual metaphor, but they extend the conceptual metaphor in novel directions, in different directions. And we can say a lot of those same sorts of things on a virus metaphor. So we can talk about how crime plagues and infects cities, and how detectives can diagnose and treat a problem, and how the prevalence of crime is chronic or a crime epidemic. So for any given social issue, there tends to be numerous metaphors that are extended systematically, and we can say a lot of the same things on the different metaphors. But it may be the case that some of these metaphors encourage certain kind of inferences more than others. And so that's what we're going to explore in this first experiment. So what would it mean to think in terms of a metaphor? What would it mean to say that a metaphor is influencing the way that we think? And at a really high level, we're gonna take the position that if metaphors reflect thought patterns, then inferences should be consistent with the metaphor that we give people. So if people are thinking about crime as a virus, then people should make inferences about crime that are consistent with some virus schema. And if people are thinking about crime as a beast after they're being told that crime is a beast, they should make inferences and suggestions maybe about how to deal with crime that are consistent with thinking about crime as a beast. So using some sort of beast schema. And so we, in a pilot set of studies, we asked naive participants how they would solve a literal beast problem and a literal virus problem. And we just looked for patterns, looked for themes that were consistent in these responses. And here are some of the things that people said for solving a literal beast problem. Get animal control, or organize a group of citizens to hunt down the beast, capture the beast, build walls around the beast so it lives in solitude, find a way to kill the animal. So the big themes in these responses were we need to capture the beast and then we need to contain it. And for the virus problem, for a literal virus problem, we also found two overarching themes. So people said things like, find out what the virus is, attempt to create an antivirus, how is the virus spreading, maintain sanitary conditions within the community, improve the people's immune system. So the two overarching themes that we found in people's descriptions of how to solve a virus problem were diagnose what's really going on, so figure out the root cause of this problem, and treat that root cause, so implement some sort of social reform to prevent the spread of this disease. And so what our hypothesis is going into this experiment is that when we frame crime as a beast, we think people should be more likely to suggest increasing the police force and increasing prison sentences. So they should emphasize enforcement-oriented approaches to crime, because those are analogous to how we would solve a literal beast problem. If a lion escaped from the zoo, we would try to capture and contain it. If we're thinking about crime as a beast and instantiating this beast schema in the context of crime, then we're going to try to capture and contain crime by increasing the police force and putting people in jail longer. When we encourage people to think of crime as a virus, so when we use a virus metaphor to frame crime, we expect people to suggest diagnosing and treating the problem. So looking to investigate the root cause of the crime problem and maybe implementing some social reforms to address those problems. Here is the crime report that we presented to participants in our experiment. So this was a between subject experiment. Some people read the beast version, other people read the virus version. In some cases, there was just this one-word difference between the reports. So it read, crime is a beast or virus ravaging the city of Addison. 5 years ago, Addison was in good shape with no obvious vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, in the past 5 years, the city's defense systems have weakened and the city has succumbed to crime. Today, there are more than 55,000 criminal incidents a year, up by more than 10,000 per year. There's a worry that if the city doesn't regain its strength soon, even more serious problems may start to develop. So participants read one of the metaphors in the first sentence, and then in both conditions, the rest of the report was the same. And then they were asked to make a judgment about what Addison should do to reduce crime. And in the first couple versions of the experiment, this was just a free response question. People just wrote whatever came to mind. And we coded their responses as emphasizing enforcement, as in law enforcement should be stricter and the justice system harsher, or social reform. So study the causes of crime and implement strategies to address these causes through health, education, healthcare, education, etc. So these are some real responses that participants gave, and most could be coded into an enforcement bin or a social reform bin. There were a few that couldn't be coded into either, as in 330 murders a year doesn't seem like that many. I'm from LA. So some people didn't have a suggestion, some people didn't think this was a big problem. Got some fun responses. And here's what we find. So here's the results of 2 experiments, one with college students, many of whom were actually recruited from Merced. I think while I was doing this, got a very generous offer from Teeny for lots of participants. And so a lot of these participants are Merced students. And then we also ran the study online. And the y-axis shows the proportion of responses that emphasize enforcement. In red, we have people who read that crime is a beast. In blue, people who read that crime is a virus. And so the white space above the bars is the proportion of people who suggested reform. And the pattern that we see in both experiments is that reading the beast metaphor makes people more enforcement-oriented relative to reading the virus metaphor. And it's about a 20 percentage point difference. So, it's a moderate but fairly robust effect in this free response paradigm. And we got it with college students and a more representative sample that was recruited online. One critique of this approach was that it may just be the case that these metaphors are making certain responses more available in the minds of the participants. So reading that crime is a beast may call to mind enforcement-oriented approaches to crime. And so we ran a follow-up experiment with multiple choice responses that were inspired by the responses that people generated in the free response version. And those were coded into 2 enforcement-oriented options and 2 reform-oriented options. So the enforcement-oriented options emphasized increasing prison sentences and street patrols. The reform options emphasized changing educational practices or expanding economic welfare programs. And so in this third experiment, we still see an effect of the metaphor frame. It's a little bit smaller, so it's on the order of 10 percentage points as opposed to 20. Yeah.
So, just a question about the critique there.
Sure.
Wasn't your central hypothesis that these sort of responses become more available, that we want to make responses in line with the metaphors that we've been sort of shown?
Yeah. So I agree that the critique that it's not a devastating critique. So if the metaphors just made the certain response options more available, I think that would still be interesting. But the claim was that in the real world, so in a voting situation, for example, if I'm asked to choose between 2 options, if a metaphor doesn't influence me in that kind of a context, it's a little bit less interesting.
Okay.
So on practical grounds, it might be a little bit less interesting. And on theoretical grounds, it may be a little bit less interesting as well. So, good question. We also ran another version where we asked people to forage for information. So we framed the task as crime is a virus or a beast, and here are 4 areas of the city that you can get more information about. So one of these areas is probably not pulling its weight in terms of addressing the crime problem, providing adequate defenses for the crime problem, and you can forage for more information about one of these 4 things, and even in that kind of a context where people are doing some information seeking as opposed to making an explicit judgment about how to reduce crime, you still see this effect of the metaphor. So people who get the beast metaphor are more likely to say, well, you need to investigate the police force, you need to get more information about the prison system. People who get the virus metaphor are more likely to say, well, let's look at what's going on in the educational system to figure out what might be going on with crime.
Switch back. Smooth hand up. So another aspect of the domain of crime is not how people think about crime itself or criminals, but how people think about law enforcement. And so this is an issue that Paul and I talked about a lot, because in the last few years we've seen many high-profile clashes between law enforcement and the communities that they serve or that they're supposed to be serving. And in the last 20 years, you've also seen changes in the kind of institutional structure of law enforcement in the United States. And kind of one thing you've witnessed is that's commented on a lot is a militarization of the police force in the United States. So, for example, you have small towns in New Hampshire that now have tanks and fully equipped SWAT teams with machine guns, and even promotional materials developed by law enforcement that are supposed to be useful, that are supposed to help police officers train them, because this is an extremely difficult and dangerous job. What you're seeing is an emphasis on the warrior, the fighting, the military aspects of law enforcement. So here you see an image we pulled from a Facebook group that's for law enforcement that's emphasizing being a warrior. And up at the top you see something that's pulled from a law enforcement manual that's about developing a warrior mindset. And so one comment that some people have suggested is that this warrior metaphor for law enforcement might be driving some of the more violent reactions and more negative attitudes towards law enforcement. And interestingly, this project sort of got kicked off by an article, a New York Times article we read about President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing that was released last year. And this quote was in the New York Times article, and we sort of shared this and developed a project from that. But what the task force report reads is that law enforcement culture should embrace a guardian rather than a warrior mindset to build trust and legitimacy both within agencies and with the public. So very explicitly, Obama's team was suggesting changing the dominant metaphor used to describe law enforcement. And so one set of studies that we conducted was looking at whether these metaphors have this kind of persuasive power in the same way that the beast and virus metaphors do in the context of crime and criminals. So we did a very simple study where our participants, we said, listen, we're interested in your attitudes towards law enforcement. So they read a paragraph explaining the role of law enforcement using one of these two metaphors. So they either read, police officers are the guardians of modern communities, or the warriors of modern communities, strong men and women who serve a vital role in society, often placing themselves in harm's way in order to protect or fight for their fellow citizens. So they just read one of these two reports. And then they responded to a series of questions, some yes, no, some sort of Likert scale questions, assessing their attitudes towards policing. So questions like, do you feel more safe or unsafe around police officers, rate on a scale? Do you think police officers have a very easy or very difficult job? Are police officers very ineffective or very effective at maintaining law and order? Do you think the criminal justice system is very far from or very near to the ideal, and so on? And from that, we could collapse these into a measure of basically how positive or negative are your attitudes towards the police. And I'm reporting the results here of two experiments that were nearly identical. In the second one, we changed one little thing about the reports, but it's otherwise pretty much the same. And again, what we're showing here is the higher up you are on the y-axis here, the more positive your attitudes were towards law enforcement. And so just providing people with that guardian metaphor led people to have a more positive set of attitudes towards law enforcement. So suggesting that Obama's team is onto something when they're trying to change the nature of the conversation around what the role of law enforcement is. So these are some of the studies we've done. We'll touch on a few more in our next set of the talk, but this work is part of a growing body of research on how metaphor framing can affect people's attitudes, beliefs, reasoning in a variety of important social domains. So some work has been looking on the role that the sort of enemy and war metaphors in the context of cancer and how people feel and think about cancer and what kind of preventative behaviors they take in their daily lives to prevent cancer, how that might affect them. Some recent work has also looked at how immigration is often talked about as a contamination of the body of the country and how that might affect people's attitudes towards immigration. An article that was just published last week was quite interesting, looked at different metaphors for how ideas come about. So are ideas like just light bulbs turning on in your mind or seeds that are nurtured? One really interesting thing about that article is they find a big difference by gender. So when you think about men as geniuses, like Ben Franklin coming up with ideas, you're more likely to think that they just appear to them. Whereas when people think about genius women who come up with ideas, it takes this more nurturing approach. And this might have downstream effects on how, let's say, people treat their male versus female colleagues or students. A couple things we're going to talk about later in the talk. One project we've been working on with Teeny is the difference between talking about climate change as something we need to fight against, a war, or a race that we need to kind of compete against. And we'll get to the results of that study later. And something that Paul first developed, and we'll talk about it later in a study that we ran in India, what basically looked at 10 different issues. And you can basically find effects of metaphor frames in lots of different domains. But the next thing we're going to turn to, and I'll pass it off to Paul again, is this question of how metaphors work, which Paul started to talk about in the last section, but we're going to take a little deeper now and look at kind of the specifics of the different cognitive mechanisms at work.
Thank you. All right, so we changed it back off because I'm going to jump back into the crime studies for a second. So one question that's related to the idea of availability that I mentioned earlier is that these effects might be the result of simple spreading activation, simple lexical priming. So one possibility is that when people are in the beast condition, they see the word beast, activation from the word beast spreads to related words like monster and animal and attack and fight and hunt and capture and catch. And those words, fight, capture, and catch, tend to be used in a policing and crime context to talk about enforcement-oriented approaches to crime. And those words are also related to words like criminal and arrest and detain, and so that may lead people to suggest increasing the number of police on the streets or increasing prison sentences for criminals. And if this is how the metaphors are influencing thought, that would be kind of interesting. But again, it would point to something that we already sort of know about language, and maybe metaphors having a different kind of effect on people. And we'll talk about what that different kind of effect might be as we go through. So we tested this lexical priming account, both in the crime study and in the policing study, by asking people to list a synonym for the word virus or beast. So this was a between subjects manipulation. And then participants read a non-metaphorically framed description, either of crime in the crime case or policing case. And then for the crime situation, they made a judgment about how this fictional city should address their crime problem. And in the policing case, we asked them about their attitudes towards police officers. So in that study, people listed a synonym for guardian or warrior. And people generally don't have any problems doing that. And what we find in the crime situation is that we get an effect of the metaphorical frames. So when crime is explicitly described as a virus or a beast, that influences people's suggestion for how crime should be addressed. But when people just list a synonym for virus or beast, that in turn doesn't seem to have an effect on their crime reducing suggestion. And similarly, it doesn't seem to have an effect on people's attitudes towards police officers. But it does have an effect on their attitudes towards police officers when guardian or warrior are used explicitly as a metaphor to describe police officers. So these effects don't seem to be explainable merely in terms of spreading activation or lexical priming. So we're going to use a couple terms. We're going to talk in terms of contextualized schema activation, so kind of a jargony term here, and then we'll also talk about this in terms of structure mapping, which is maybe familiar to some of us. So in terms of the reason we're going to use the term contextualized schema activation is because the way that we've structured these reports is intentional. We've included lots of words and phrases that are ambiguous in terms of what they mean out of context. So terms like vulnerabilities or defense systems or weakened. So when a city is described as vulnerable, or that it is, or when the city's described as having weak defense systems, it's unclear what exactly those things mean. So we think that the different metaphors may lead people to interpret those kinds of words and phrases in different ways. On a beast metaphor, maybe a vulnerable city is one that doesn't have a strong police force or a strong criminal justice system. And on a virus metaphor, a vulnerable city is one that has a lot of poverty and has a weak infrastructure or bad schools. And so these particular words and phrases may give people an opportunity to instantiate a different representation of this crime problem when it's framed on two different metaphors. And we find some evidence for this possibility in a version of the study where we just move the metaphorical frame from the beginning of the report to the end of the report. And when we move the metaphorical frame to the end of the report, we don't see an effect of the metaphorical frame. So it seems important that these metaphors are presented early so that they can influence the representation of this problem that people are building online. And with that, another hand.
Good. We have 15 more handouts. So another way of thinking about this issue, so this isn't maybe a different mechanism, it's just another approach to thinking about what we think is going on in these studies, is the notion of structure mapping across domains, which is an idea that comes from work by Dedra Gentner, principally, in thinking about how people basically reason in terms of similarity or analogy across domains. So I love this comic, this XKCD comic, for a couple of reasons. It's kind of meta, but it's actually doing an explicit structure mapping between two domains that are themselves metaphors to the police. So in the context of this talk, it works really well. But I'll walk you through it. So the caption of the comic is, I just realized these are literally the same people, although of course this is the figurative use of the word literally. The fashion police and the grammar police, again, two metaphorical domains, but hopefully you understand them. And what the author here is doing is giving you the mapping structures, talking about the features and roles of individuals who are in these two groups that align, that map to one another. So people in both groups are judgmental and smug, angry about something deeply arbitrary, they have strong opinions backed by style guides, and so on and so forth. And so this is a case where they're doing explicitly the mapping of structures across two conceptual domains. So the basic idea of structure mapping is that our concepts have structure. We don't just store random features and colors and whatnot. We actually kind of have, in a sense, structured mental models or representations of different domains. What are the roles of the individuals or individual elements in the domains, and how do they relate to one another? And the idea behind structure mapping is that what metaphors and analogies and other kinds of comparisons do is they highlight and help you align structural similarities between conceptual representations. So what the author's doing here is aligning for you the structures between the fashion police and the grammar police. And then this can be used to drive inference, because if you don't know something about one of the domains, but you've mapped it onto the structure of the other, that's gonna allow you to now make a new inference based on what you know about one domain to another. Now, in the case of metaphors, what we've been talking about so far and what you often see is that we use a more concrete, sort of well-known domain as a metaphor for talking about a more abstract or complicated domain. So we use, for example, a beast metaphor to talk about crime, this more complex problem. So this was the sort of idea that Paul was talking about before in setting up the hypotheses for the original study. What does it mean to think metaphorically? And so I kind of diagrammed it like this here. Think about the domain of crime. In our minds, this is a very overwhelmingly complex and abstract domain. There's lots of different causes, there's lots of different ways to address it, and it's unclear what you should choose to do in a certain circumstance. How should you think about it? And when the beast metaphor is activated at the beginning of the report, and you're building this mental model of the domain as you're going through our task, what's happening is there's a mapping of structure between what we know about beasts and what we know about crime. And so the fact that a beast is an individual aggressor gets mapped on to the fact that criminals are individuals. And of course, what do you do with the individuals? In a beast domain, you hunt and cage them, and similarly, in a crime domain, you hunt and capture them. It's the active processing of law enforcement. And so that's going to drive people's inferences. So again, this is just building on what Paul was talking about kind of contextualized schema activation. We think it's leading to this process of structure mapping. Conversely, when the virus metaphor is instantiated, what ends up happening is the structure of the crime domain is mapped onto the virus structure. So one way we've tried to investigate this idea about is structure mapping going on is looking at this other domain I'll talk about, the metaphor that the federal budget is like your household budget. And in the study I'm going to describe, we give people the same information about the two domains, the federal budget and the household budget, except for we either encourage people to map the structures or not. And we see how that affects their inferences. So the idea that the federal budget is like your household budget, this metaphor, is extremely popular. It's been part of kind of GOP, the Republican rhetoric for the last a long while, probably since Reagan at least. And so the Romney campaign in 2012 loved this metaphor. And so they released, for example, again, kind of these explicit mappings of structures between the household budget and the federal budget, with the inference being that you should vote for the person who's not going to overspend, who's not going to add to the debt, because that's bad. Would you add to the debt in your family? You know that's bad. Now, this happened, and there was a media response from economists and journalists who said, no, your federal budget is not like a household budget, and they listed all these differences. So there are similarities and differences, much like between any two domains that you might draw a comparison or analogy between. So if you think about it this way, there are similarities between the federal budget and the household budget. So families take in money, and the government takes in money. Families spend that money on goods and services. The government spends their money on goods and services. A balanced budget means you spend less than you take in. And if you do go into debt and spend more, that can lower your credit rating. Well, the same thing can happen with the country. There are lots of differences between them. I'll just highlight one, which is that in your family, people have jobs and the income's relatively fixed. You might be able to get a new job or a promotion, but it's pretty fixed. On the other hand, the government could do lots of things like printing new money, changing trade policies, increasing taxes, cutting loopholes. There's a lot of things that can happen to change the amount of income that's available to spend or shuttle it around in ways your household can't. So one thing that's interesting about this particular domain is that politicians who use this metaphor have a very particular inference they want voters exposed to the metaphor to draw. So the idea is this: if your household budget is like the federal budget, then just like you can't spend more than you make, because that's bad, you'll lose all your stuff, you could go to jail, all this horrible things, the government should spend less money, and you should vote for the person who says they're going to cut spending. That's their name. Cut spending, end the debt. We're in trillions of dollars in debt. Wow, that sounds bad. But there's an unintended inference that we reasoned is revealed by the fact that you're mapping these two structures together, by this structure mapping idea. And that's the issue that the president is the head of the national household. That just like you, in this case, are the head of your household, potentially, the president is the head of the national household. And so the unintended inference is that the president should be someone that is good with money, that their personal expertise with money should matter. Certainly Romney didn't mind the fact that he was really wealthy, and Trump is doing the same thing, trying to encourage this, but they didn't intend that this necessarily becomes part of people's decision-making when it comes to voting. They care about the person who's cutting spending, not the individual financial abilities of the president. But in our study, we figured people might make that inference that the personal financial status of the presidential candidate would matter when the structures of the household and federal budgets were mapped onto one another. So in our study, people, again, between subject design, read one of two reports. So people who got the explicit similarity one, the one where we emphasize mapping the structures, got that there are several important ways in which the federal budget is similar to a household. We noted the differences. Although only governments can produce money, both have the potential to accumulate debt. Of course, governments have much more control over their revenue. In addition to being able to create money, they have control over tax rates, interest rates, and trade policies. But just like a household, if a government fails to pay their debt, their credit rating declines, and they may have a harder time securing a loan in the future. So we're noting the differences, but we're emphasizing you should map these domains to one another. Those who saw the difference report got the same information, the exact same amounts of similarities and differences, but we basically discouraged the structure mapping between the domains. So they got, there are several important ways in which federal budget is different from a household. Although both have the potential to accumulate debt, only governments can produce money. Of course, if a household or government fails to pay their debt, their credit rating will decline and they may have a harder time securing a loan in the future. But unlike a household, governments have much more control over their revenue. In addition to being able to create money, they have control over tax rates, interest rates, and trade policies. So here, same info, but we're emphasizing the differences. In other words, we're discouraging the mapping. And then we asked them a bunch of questions, and these two target questions were the key pieces of information we were interested in. We asked, just to rate on a scale, would you be more likely to vote for a presidential candidate who had grown his or her wealth? And would you be less likely to vote for a candidate who had problems managing his or her personal assets? So asking now just about the personal financial history of a candidate. And I'm showing you the results of 2 studies. The second one was a direct pre-registered replication of the first. And what you're seeing is a small but very reliable and robust finding, which is that when we encourage people to map household budget domain onto the federal budget domain, they express more willingness to vote for someone who had grown their own wealth and a less of a willingness to vote for someone who had a personal history of financial problems. Suggesting that by encouraging this structure mapping across domains, we really are getting people to make inferences based on kind of the structural alignment of those domains in their minds as they're processing our report and answering questions about it. And the final sort of mechanistic piece about how metaphors work that we want to talk about is the affective component, the emotional component. So when we think about metaphors, we often think about writers and singers and artists who use metaphors as part of the poetic beauty of prose to get our emotions going, and that does matter for decision making. So our emotional states do influence how we make decisions, and the sort of affective valence of particular metaphorical domains might also impact the sorts of attitudes and decisions people form as they're engaged in our tasks. So to give you one example, in our policing study, one thing we did in our first experiment was before we framed our report in any way, so before we gave people the metaphor that, let's say, police are guardians of the community, we just asked people to list whatever ideas or words they associate with the concept of a guardian and a warrior. So this is just free response. Type what comes to mind when you think of a guardian. Type what comes to mind when you think of a warrior. And for some of the participants, this happened in a neutral context. This is the first thing they did. They started the study, and this is what happens. We used James Pennebaker's LIWC, the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count program, to basically get a quantitative measure of how positive or negative the language was that people used. And basically what this tool does is words have been hand-coded by Pennebaker and his colleagues as either being kind of positively valenced or negatively valenced. There's lots of categories that they use in this model, but these are the ones we were interested in. And so we just get a sense about how many positive and versus negative words people come up with that come to mind when they see the term warrior or guardian. And what you can see here is people have quite positive views of both guardians and warriors in this neutral context, and somewhat more negative views of warriors than guardians in general, but overall people are overwhelmingly have positive attitudes. So that was half our participants, or a third actually. For the other set of participants, first we asked them the questions about their attitudes towards policing. So we put them in a kind of policing context. And then we asked them kind of what words come to mind when you think of guardians or warriors. So we basically asked kind of what comes to mind when these words are used in the context of thinking about law enforcement. And here we see a big difference. First of all, overall people's list fewer positively valenced words. And what you end up seeing, though, is a large differentiation between, in terms of negative words for the warrior concept. So in the policing context, the word warrior, this metaphor, brings to mind more negativity. And it's possible that one of the reasons we see differences in attitudes towards police when we're using the warrior metaphor, more negative attitudes, is that this warrior concept in the context of law enforcement just is more negatively valenced. It's making people have more negative thoughts, especially about the police, since that's what they're being asked about. Another domain in which the valence of a metaphor might affect kind of how people think about the issue comes from the study we've been working on with Teeny, which is metaphors for climate change. So in particular, we are looking at the war metaphor. So war as a domain for metaphors and social and political issues are quite common. So you hear about the war on terror, the war on poverty, the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on Christmas, all the different wars. And where you see it as well is this war against climate change, as if climate change is this kind of person we're battling against. And so we did our typical framing report, although we instantiated the metaphor several times in the report. So it started off, this isn't the full report. In the interest of time, I've just given you the good stuff. So we say, when will Americans start to combat versus go after excessive energy use and kill the problems or surge ahead on the problems related to air pollution, the destruction of natural resources? Then we gave people just a kind of look basically like an Associated Press article, details about what the United States goals were for reducing carbon emissions, a bunch of stats and data, like in the crime report. And then we ended it with, this is a war or this is a race we can't afford to lose. And our hypothesis was that this war metaphor is very negatively valenced. And it kind of gives people this sense of urgency. In a war, it's not just like a race that, okay, you lost the race, you still live. If you lose a war, you die. It's much more negative in that sense. So we asked people questions that sort of tapped into this valence dimension. So we asked questions about how urgent do you think it is for the US to implement energy reduction programs right away? How much risk people perceive, so to what extent are you concerned about the following potential consequences of climate change, like soil erosion, drought, and international conflict? And we also asked kind of a key question, which was, how willing are you to change your own conservation behavior? So things like, would you be willing to pay a carbon offset cost on future purchases of items derived from fossil fuels? And in all cases, we ran 3 different versions of the study. We've collapsed the data here into this graph from all 3 samples. In every case, you find that talking about a war against climate change leads to a greater sense of urgency, a greater perception of risk, and as a result, a greater willingness to at least say you're going to engage in more conservation behavior. So we think a lot of this is being driven by the valence of the war message, although there's certainly a structure mapping element there as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Paul for the final section here.
Thanks, Steve. So now we're going to talk about some of the moderators of these effects, and we'll do it quickly because we know we're running out of time. So one thing I've done recently with this kind of work was to test whether extending the metaphor into the language of response options would bolster the effect of the metaphor frame. And so just to give you a sense of what that looks like, for the crime example, people read that crime was a virus or a beast, and then in one case there was just two alternative forced choice, multiple choice question at the end that said either reform educational practices or increase street patrols. So participants were asked to choose one of those 2 options. And in an alternative version, we extended the metaphor frame to the consistent response options. So we thought that reform would be consistent with virus, and by pairing that with the word treat, which is related to virus, and an attack we paired with increasing street patrols, which is consistent with the beast metaphor for crime. By extending that metaphoric language into the description of the response options, we get a bigger effect of the metaphor frame. So it goes from about a 10 percentage point shift to about a 20 percentage point shift with extended metaphors. We've done some work looking at how people's social language use and experience affects their likelihood of being influenced by a metaphor frame. So in this study, we used 10 metaphorically framed issues with inference questions. So crime was framed as a beast or a virus. Schools were framed as either factories that mold young minds or gardens that nurture young minds. And we looked at this, at whether people would give responses that were conceptually congruent with the metaphors that they were framed with, that these issues were framed with. We did this with 3 groups of participants. So we did it with native English speakers from the US, and then separately we did it online with a sample from India. And we asked a variety of questions of this sample, but one of the things that we did was we categorized people as more formal speakers of English. So everybody in this population was a non-native English speaker, second language English speaker. But about half said that they spoke English in formal environments, like at school or at work, and the other half said that they spoke English mostly with friends and family. We also asked questions about their language proficiency. And language proficiency didn't actually matter as much as this categorization scheme in explaining the results. And so what we find is that US native speakers of English responded to these metaphorically framed issues congruently more often than chance. The effect is fairly small, so a shift of about 10 percentage points. What we have on the y-axis is a congruence measure, which if people are responding at chance, then they'll be at 0.5 congruent, and about 0.55 congruent is about a 10% shift in the effect of the metaphor. Among participants from India who spoke English primarily in formal settings, we see people responding at about chance. And among participants from India who reported speaking English primarily in informal settings, we see an influence of the metaphor. So this suggests that the context in which people use use language and use these metaphors potentially is one factor that influences their susceptibility to metaphor framing effects. So social language use and experience seems to matter. In addition, the strength of people's prior beliefs tends to matter. So in the crime studies, Republicans tended to be more enforcement-oriented than independents and Democrats. So this is data from the free response version of the study. And showing that these data for a couple reasons. One, it gives us a way to contextualize the effect size that we found in our studies. So in the free response version of the studies, we found shifts on the order of about 20 percentage points, which is consistent with the shifts that we're seeing as a function of people's political ideology. And we can also look at how influential the metaphors are by political affiliation. And we see that the metaphors are more influential among Democrats and independents than they are among Republicans. And I don't think it's the case that Republicans are less susceptible to metaphor frames in general, but it's more likely the case that they have a stronger commitment to enforcement-oriented approaches to crime reduction. And one reason that that conclusion seems more likely is because we get kind of a parallel effect with the budget framing study. So in the budget framing study, participants are asked how likely they would be to vote for a candidate who's had problems managing their wealth, and how likely they would be to vote for a candidate who's grown their wealth. And the Democrats are least influenced by that, by these questions. So Republicans are very likely to say that they're going to vote for a candidate who's grown their wealth, and very unlikely to say that they vote for a candidate who's had problems with their wealth. And if we look at the effect of the metaphor framing manipulation or the conceptual framing manipulation, we can see that it has a much bigger effect on Republicans and independents and a pretty small effect on Democrats. And so here, Republicans are being influenced by the manipulation and Democrats aren't. And it might be because Democrats are just less interested in the personal financial history of candidates relative to independents and Republicans. So the strength of people's prior beliefs matter a lot.
Finish it up. All right. So that's kind of a sampling of where we are in this current set of work. And so these are sort of the takeaway messages that we hope we've conveyed. Metaphors are pervasive and systematic, especially in the context of talking about big, important, complex, abstract ideas and domains. These metaphors can influence how people think and reason about these important social and political issues. They do so in a number of ways. We've tried to highlight a couple important factors. One, they structure and organize the domains they're used to describe. So we can use our knowledge of the kind of metaphorical source domain to structure how we build a mental model of the target domain in question. And they also influence how people feel about issues. They also do have this affective component. But there are several important factors that moderate the persuasive power of metaphors. These aren't magical devices, as some have tried to argue, but they in principle interact with other kinds of background linguistic and cognitive processes. This is an ongoing project. It's been kind of fun to present it together since we've been working on these things very closely. But we're hoping to build this project out in a few directions. So one thing we're interested in is more about how metaphors work and how they affect different aspects of cognition. So we're really interested in things like, do metaphors affect what people pay attention to online in the moment? Do they affect what people remember about conversations, debates, articles they've read? We're interested, again, in these questions about when do metaphors work? So are there some domains, for example, that are more susceptible to influence from metaphors than others? Can we quantify that in some way? Is it something to do with complexity or how abstract a domain is, or how much experience people have already with that domain? And we're really interested as well in this question of who is more susceptible to influence and why. So for example, Paul's talking about this work we've been doing with non-native English speakers in India, and one interesting thing there that kind of links up with other research on the social pragmatics of language is it seems informal social use matters for whether these metaphors are effective. And that's interesting because it comports with other research that says that people who have social deficits, like those with autism spectrum disorders or schizophrenia, who have problems reasoning about social domains, they also have problems interpreting metaphors. So that might be an area of linkage we're looking to get more into. So we want to thank you for listening. We hope this lecture has been food for thought and that it's not too hard to digest, especially if the claims are hard to swallow, which might be the case if they were filled with half-baked ideas. Those leave a bad taste in everybody's mouth. And so thank you to our collaborators.